I wanted to single out the two dynamics of contestation. It's not just sort of a term that, to my worry, has sort of become very sort of almost like a fad, that contestation turned out to be a good thing, but nobody knew exactly why, because everything is contested, but that's been like that all the time. So we need to know what contestation actually does in order to work with it. So contestation, one dynamic would be objection, and that's of course something where, which is unpleasant, but also it can also be an indicator. So objection to compliance with norms indicates to us that somebody isn't happy with the concept. But objection can also mean objection to norm breach or a violation of a norm, because somebody brings their values to the table and says, well, we need to see that this norm is no longer violated. So that's reactive contestation, which works as an indicator that something is wrong. So it's an indicator of dissensus. The other form of contestation is critical engagement with a norm. And here, I call that proactive contestation, where somebody is prepared to engage and allowed to engage, to talk about their interpretation of a norm. And the condition here is, or that is a condition for consensus. In the absence of proactive contestation, we will not have the consensus that we need for a norm to be actually followed and widely shared. Now, what are norms? Norms are very broadly speaking soft institutions. I think that's the most general term here. And they have a dual quality, and that's important. They are not just socially constructed from the bottom up, but they also structure behavior when they are robust and in place. So social construction carries knowledge. That's where we come to the knowledge. And important is that these norms regulate behavior as structures, they prescribe behavior, and they also come from the bottom up. Now, key issue for, of course, what's coming up here today is where do norms work? And what do they mean to stakeholders in a given order? Where they generate both prescriptive and value-based indicators. Now, I'll move on here to addressing norms as both social facts and norms as values, as I said before. Even in, I mean, this might sound frightfully academic, but even in academia, we have spent much more time talking about norms as facts, which bracketed the distinct meanings that norms have when they travel across the boundaries of order. And that's where values come in, which are brought in from the bottom up. And that's why we need to look at practices in order to understand what norms can do and what degree of legitimacy we can expect in an order that is not formally set, and that's what world politics is. So the assumption here is that if contestation is a sine qua non for norm acceptance, it follows that only a contested norm can ever become a good norm. So that's the principle that I take out of James Tully's public philosophy. So we have to have some input in order to then own that norm, to quote another EUI graduate, Antje Wiener. So then we now need to see how we actually how can we operationalize contestation? I mean, that's something where we then move into politics, whose practices count in the process of norm contestation, and whose practices ought to count. And that's something where we could think in terms of the threshold of pathways to places where cyber norms are discussed. Now here is the scenario on where I talk I make a suggestion for the cyber norms that come into play, that have been developed in 2015. And to see where these norms are contested on local sites and how to facilitate stakeholder presentation. So if we zoom in on local sites, and this is just a prelude, what matters is that we have distinct norm types, and I won't bore you with that too long, but different types of norms, different scales in the order where actually negotiations take place, and different stages that can be distinguished typically in the process of norm contestation. In my theory, there's also more sort of power and validity attached to it, but I spare you that. What we need to ask is, what is the moral reach of a norm? Is it kind of stripped of all kind of ethical, moral value, and can we simply take the norm at face value? Or is it like a norm that carries much more sort of moral reach? And I come to examples in a moment. And then from that, we can expect, or we can identify certain degrees of contestation that are to be expected. And this is distinguished between how much objection can we expect with reference to a particular type of norm, and how much proactive engagement is required in order to implement a norm. If you think about sovereignty, everybody will agree that sovereignty is somehow a good thing, but how to actually work with it in global politics requires particular regulations and steps and rules about interaction. Now, these are the sites. 9 sort of sites can be distinguished if you look at stages of norm implementation as one that could be the constituting state. That would usually be a UN setting. Then you would have a negotiating state. That's where a lot of the cyberspace norm governance negotiations are currently at. And then you have the implementing stage. Oh, I can't, yeah. And if you look at the various scales in global order, of course, you have the macro, the most powerful, down to the micro, the least powerful. And the point here is, without talking about this too much, site 5 is the one where most of what matters to cyberspace governance is currently happening. So the open-ended working group would be pretty much located in site 5. So how does that look like? If you look at the fundamental principles, and I'm almost done. If you look at the fundamental principles that operate in cyberspace governance, then on the macro level, you have clearly, there's a reference to human rights, there's a reference to sovereignty, non-intervention, that always comes up. As I just said, we expect very little reactive contestation on these norms. Everybody will say, sure, fine. But it requires a lot of proactive engagement in order to make them work all the way across the various orders. Now, then of course you have the new norm, the specific cyberspace governance norm, prevent ICT activity contrary to its obligations under international law. Okay, sounds good. That's a norm that really, as it's a driver in cyberspace governance, but we need to know how to actually carve it out. What are the parts of it? What is the meaning? What are the rules, the regulations, and so on? And this is where it's so important to move to the type 2, what I call the organizing principle. That's really the center. That would be our site 5, where we have questioned about the use of territory of the norms, sort of not knowingly use the use of territory for malicious cyber attacks, and so on. A couple of norms that are currently in the process of being fleshed out. They've been noted in the council government, and here you'll see the expected moral reach is usually kind of moderate, and the impact of proactive and reactive contestation is at a balance, which means this is the space where contestation among equals becomes possible. And that's where this side is so important with regard to the question of how to enable access to contestation via pathways here. And then the final group are the micro-standards, where we expect with very sort of thin moral standards. So these will mainly be reacted with when people don't understand them, when people feel they have been left out and they cannot accept the norm at face value. Consider the norms that the specific norms that I listed here as suggestions. As I said, I'm not expert in cyber governance, but according to my background, this is where, for example, International Code of Conduct for Information Security, that could be a good sort of clear a standard norm where we don't require a lot of further proactive engagement once the code of conduct is set.